In this session, I'm addressing a very challenging subject. I'm calling it evaluating or analyzing the ministry of a local church. So let me qualify that a little further. I'm addressing this area from the standpoint of my personal ministry experience and my present work in church revitalization, and that's a little different. When I was a full-time senior pastor, evaluation and analysis of our ministry was a given. Not only did I feel that we needed regular evaluation from our staff, but we had staff retreats, seminars, and outside speakers who lent their insights to our ministry. The principles of church revitalization can cover any church, and so much of what I will say here fits any circumstance. However, my focus here is on the pastor and the church that find themselves in need of more than just a tune-up, but probably need something like a complete overhaul. Evaluating a local church ministry is very challenging for a number of reasons. Let me give you some of those. First of all, it's challenging because it can and probably should cover not only the work of the local church and its ministries, but also the people who do the work too. For example, have those who work in any given ministry been given the training and tools that are needed for the job? Of course, the folks in a church have some degree of intimidation about analysis as a rule anyway, because they are largely volunteers who are doing that work. And so analysis or evaluation that is related to them about their church ministry sometimes is intimidating, and so that has to be alleviated as much as possible. But that's one of the reasons why evaluation of a local church ministry is pretty challenging. A second reason is because in today's legal atmosphere, you have to ask if those who work in a church ministry have been given all the necessary background checks and qualified adequately for that local church situation. Some folks are okay with background checks, and others have to be encouraged about it. But it is the atmosphere in which we live, and would be wise to regard that. A third reason why evaluating a church is risky or challenging, I should say, is of necessity. Evaluation includes the pastor and his leadership. He has to be open to and lead in the evaluation of a church, the church he serves, or else there will just not be an adequate analysis. Most pastors are often supportive about analysis of their ministry, and that's why pastors go to seminars and they hear trusted speakers who offer insights that bring ministry advantages. But there's an element of making judgments, the good kind, that are always necessary and produce some degree of discomfort because it signals sometimes significant change. And change is scary for us. Evaluation almost always means making changes. Probably hear that old adage attributed to Albert Einstein seems appropriate. He said that the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over in the same way, but expecting different results. I remember one of our pastorates, we took several of our key laymen to a conference where we were challenged over a couple of days. We were challenged greatly about personal soul winning and growing our church with new converts, winning people to Christ, and that's absolutely the best way to grow a church. It was a great time. It was very intensive, and it turned out to be exactly what I had hoped it would be. However, as we were returning, a couple of our leaders offered that they were afraid that if we were successful with what was learned, we'd have a lot of new people coming, and they were just not sure if our church was ready for that. I was frankly quite floored by that statement. Needless to say, Their statements offered or led to several discussions in the coming days. Evaluation is especially challenging if things appear to be going smoothly and folks at a church are at peace with one another. However, smooth and peaceful in church ministry can be more of a surface condition sometimes rather than a deep-seated experience. We all want things to be smooth and at peace, but it depends on the reasons for them. And so pastors are often the first ones who need convincing of the need for evaluation. I am totally aware of that. And I'm approaching this subject with a complete respect for pastors, and might I add, for their wives as well. Fourth reason why this is a very challenging issue about church evaluation is because it is not the least concern here is the fact that there is no shortage of opinions about how to evaluate church ministry. Some are very good and insightful, but quite frankly, in my judgment, there are some just not worth the time nor the effort. I'm certainly not presenting this material as an expert, but from one who understands something of the first-hand ministry of a pastor and a local church. I encourage you who are hearing and seeing to certainly test what I say against the biblical principles about a pastor and a local church. Recently, I had a procedure that involved a miniature camera inserted in my arteries to check for blockages. It was indeed interesting, and it required an expert. So I asked my doctor, why should I trust you to put a device in my arteries and go all the way into my brain looking around? He smiled at me and told me of his training, that he was indeed a believer himself, and that he had done hundreds of these procedures before and had not lost anyone yet. I was comforted with that, relaxed a little bit, and it gave me some much-needed confidence about his abilities. He completed the procedure, and by the way, when he examined my brain, he didn't find anything. So with those qualifiers in mind, how do we evaluate a local church ministry? Well, let me offer 5 areas for consideration. The first area to consider about evaluating a local church ministry should be, and always should be, the biblical basis about that, the biblical basis of local church evaluation. The church belongs to the Lord Jesus Christ. He so loved the whole concept of the church that he gave himself for it. And he is the living Lord presently over it and will always be. As a pastor, I am only an overseer, a shepherd of the church. I refer you to Acts 20 and Paul's message to the Ephesian elders and how so very relevant all of that is. As a pastor, I'm responsible for all that is implied with the terms overseer and shepherd. I am also accountable to the Lord for all that means. Every pastor, I think, needs a fresh reminder that we are called by the Lord to serve in his church. In the book of Acts, you'll find these ideas blended together. The Apostle Paul evaluated the local churches that he founded, set pastors in place in them, and then called upon them to minister as they should. Book of Titus, the Apostle Paul sent his co-laborer Titus to the churches on the island of Crete with the mission of giving the churches what they needed, setting them in order, and especially establishing them in sound doctrine and practice. To do so, of necessity, meant evaluating what those churches were doing and indeed what they needed. That little 3-chapter book contains great organizational and leadership principles, as well as doctrinal truths that every Bible-believing pastor and church should embrace. Perhaps the best text to show the biblical basis of local church evaluation is Revelation chapters 2 and 3. where the Lord himself evaluates and counsels the pastors and the 7 local churches where they minister. In those 2 chapters, we cannot avoid the fact that pastoral and local church evaluation is ongoing. It's contemporary, and it is very, very penetrating. In other venues, I have presented those principles of local church evaluation in Revelations 2 and 3, and they are so very compelling for me personally and for churches. Of course, the main reasons I'm beginning with the biblical basis of evaluation is to show that the Scriptures give us the guidelines for evaluation and analysis, that our ministries are already under evaluation by the living Lord. He holds my church, my calling, my ministry in his hand. And I need to remember that ministry is a privilege that can be forfeited. It is not a right to be presumed. I must therefore approach this subject with some degree of fear and trembling, since it is the Lord's church and not mine. All evaluation should require the utmost care and diligence, and any approach to church evaluation must keep that biblical basis in mind. A second area for consideration in church evaluation is this. Evaluating a local church is often best served by a partnership between an able coach and the pastor. Paul's selection of Titus and Timothy as his protégés and his coaches in his absence is not accidental. These were trained, experienced, and capable men who carried the same burdens as the apostle himself. Paul sent them to specific places with specific instructions about what to do. He usually had been there himself and knew firsthand the circumstance and would address those to his helpers. Now, it's one thing to read good books to gain insights, but the insights of godly, experienced men who are on site far outweigh merely reading a book or listening to someone's lecture, including this one. A book may have stated truths on its pages, but the personal counsel of capable people who are on site is far better. I'm saying that the insights of such people today, who are like a modern Timothy or a Titus, can be extremely helpful in evaluating a local church ministry and may make the difference in success or failure. Every pastor needs at least one mentor in his life. Every local church needs to hear the voices of trusted men and women who support the ministry of that pastor, his wife, and the ministry of that local church. I have always, in my ministry, sought to bring the best speakers, preachers, and teachers to my pulpit and to our venues, knowing that our folks would spiritually prosper and the entire ministry would be enhanced by their messages. I am looking for those kinds of men and women these days who will rise to the occasion to be the Timothy and the Titus needed for young preachers, especially in our day. A third area of consideration about evaluating the ministry of local church is this. Evaluation of a local church, I believe, requires an adequate instrument of evaluation. There are at least 2 levels of evaluation needed in a local church setting because there are at least 2 levels of perception about what's going on in a local church. One is the pastor's perception. The other is the perception of the layman. Even then, this depends on the level of spiritual maturity and discernment by both. Sometimes a pastor's perception would be different, maybe even better than that of a layman, should be in some ways. But oftentimes I've had godly men and women who gave me as the pastor insights about things that I didn't see. Their perception was different than mine. And so any evaluation is going to have different levels of perception about it. Because of that, it is challenging to find a written instrument of evaluation that fits the need and covers what is necessary. And as always the case, evaluations themselves have to have proper evaluation. When I took a course in statistics, you can make statistics mean anything depending on your presuppositions and how you approach them. Here, evaluations have that same principle. And so we need an adequate instrument, but we also need common sense, biblically based evaluation of the instrument itself. So let me address three things about an instrument of evaluation. First of all, some instruments of evaluation are very complex. They're very complex, and they tend to blur the intention. For example, I just don't think it's necessary for anyone to have to answer a 250 question area or questionnaire in order to find out what their spiritual gifts are. I went through this not too long ago with a very intensive area regarding discovering spiritual gifts, and I thought it was just so unnecessary. And the reason for that primarily is because I just don't think the norm in the New Testament about discovering spiritual gifts depended on an extensive questionnaire. Now, I believe there's a spiritual discernment coupled with pastoral leadership and the insight of godly men and women that helps us discern our spiritual gifts without something being so complex we get lost in the process. Instruments of evaluation tend to be really complex. Therefore, we need one that is adequate, but not one that blurs the lines of understanding what's going on. A second area about instruments evaluation is that all instruments of evaluation depend on the given factors at play at the time of the analysis. The very same instrument of evaluation given at a different time may yield even different results. I've had that to happen with that which I use. However, someone simply needs to have common sense expertise about what is indeed at play and what's going on. But that by no means lessens the importance of having an adequate instrument of evaluation. How do we measure, in other words, what we're doing, what we should be doing, what we're not doing? Well, sometimes there are ways of doing that with an instrument of evaluation that is so very insightful and helpful. And I think, therefore, it's important for us to have that approach with an instrument evaluation. Let me mention, thirdly, that an adequate instrument of evaluation must be thoroughly based on biblical principles about ministry. I believe the best source for knowing how a local church should be structured and how it should function is the New Testament, not the results of a cultural survey of popular likes and dislikes. And I fully recognize the implications of what I'm saying here. Popular surveys may or may not be compatible with biblical principles, especially these days. We used to go door to door in surveys in order to get people's attention and invite them to church. And many of the questions we would ask a generation ago, 40 years ago, let's say, would be taken by people who had been to church, who understood some things. But now I can't presume on that kind of background that people have. I will say, I can learn what people are thinking with the cultural survey, but I learn what God thinks by knowing the Scriptures. And therefore, whatever instrument that I use, I need to trust its biblical integrity about evaluating a local church ministry. The fourth area of consideration here about evaluation of a local church ministry should include an intentional time for implementation. If you're going to evaluate a church, you're going to come up with some conclusions about things. It only makes sense to put them into practice if they indeed are the things that need to be done. and therefore the whole process should presume that there's going to be a time after the evaluation to put this into practice. It is impossible to miss this truth from the principles of evaluation, for example, in Revelation 2 and 3. The Lord intended for his directions to those pastors and those churches to be obeyed as soon as possible. He made it clear, do this or your candlestick, your lampstand will be removed. I think that is so very compelling. Any church and ministry evaluation should be entered into with it in mind that we're going to do our best to apply this where we can as soon as we can. Now, having said that, there is a long-term application of some things, and there is a short-term application of some things. Once you find out what's going on, some of those issues can be resolved or helped quickly. But with some of them, it takes a while. And again, I'm approaching this from the standpoint of church revitalization. Church revitalization is usually a 5-year process. Some things done a little quicker, but we should be patient and allow the principles to work out, and therefore short-term, long-term. Leadership needs to discern how these work in their particular situations. For example, people tend to get overwhelmed if too much is attempted too quickly. And if folks get overwhelmed, then usually nothing is going to be accomplished. People also tend to get distracted if application is postponed for too long. And therefore, a time of application must be discerned, but it also must be intentional as to how it is done. Once the evaluation is done, then it just makes sense. Let's try to get this straightened out. Let's try to get this supported. Let's try to begin this work. A fifth area, final area for consideration is this. Local church evaluation should always prioritize the needs of the pastor and his wife. That should be first on the list. Now, that may seem to be self-serving initially, but it just isn't. It is essential as a priority for a number of reasons. For example, the pastor and his wife are a team in a unique calling and work of the ministry. Now, a pastor's wife may or may not be nearly as involved as he is, of course, but his calling included her. They are one in the marriage, and the Lord's will for him is also the Lord's will for her. Unfortunately, the pastor's wife is often overlooked for renewal and revitalization or analysis ministries. I do not want to overlook either. I want to strengthen her hand in relationship, her spiritual life and ministry, as well as his. The pastor, of course, is the God-called overseer, shepherd of the local church, and therefore he should be in the seat of priority. His leadership is required in evaluation and implementation. There are excellent materials available these days for pastors and their wives about what they do. The demands, the burdens, the pressures, the stresses, the things they face in ministry are unique to them. There's nothing like it anywhere. All their stresses with all areas of life. But the calling of the eternal destiny of people that they serve, or that calling to serve and to work with the eternal destiny of people, to win people to Christ that makes the difference for all of time, is unique to that ministry. And therefore, the pastor and his wife must be priority in any evaluation, and it's priority in our church revitalization work. On a personal note, those who know my wife and I know of our efforts these days to try to encourage those in ministry. We host a number of people in our house every year where we have them come at no cost for them to laugh, pray, discuss, encourage, read, play, do whatever. We want them to leave our home feeling that they can carry on in the greatest and the most challenging work in this present world. In conclusion, I want to add that it should be understood that if there are several areas about local church evaluation that are not addressed here. I have chosen to omit some of those and highlight these. It would take a number of sessions in order to cover them, and so I've chosen the 5 main areas that I consider to be most important. My personal counsel to pastors, therefore, is this: for a pastor to consider an on-site visit by someone that you have confidence in and that who can help you evaluate your ministry and bring about godly biblical progress in that work. We probably need this more now in these days than ever in my experience. And so may the Lord give us wisdom and leadership about putting these principles into practice. Thanks. God bless.